Ola, who had always been vulnerable in matters of the heart, soon found himself opening up to her about his struggles, his frustrations, and his desires. Madame Wura listened intently, offering words of encouragement that seemed to lift his spirits. But all the while, her eyes were fixated on him, as though she could see through his soul. She offered him something he had always longed for: acceptance, admiration, and an understanding of his art in a way no one else had ever done. As they spent more time together, Ola began to feel an intense attraction to Madame Wura, one that went beyond physical desire. She made him feel seen, valued, and important. One night, after a long conversation about his dreams, she took his hand and led him to a private room in the mansion. There, surrounded by the scent of roses and the soft flicker of candlelight, she kissed him. It was unlike any kiss he had ever experienced, electric, all-consuming, and full of promise. The more time Ola spent with Madame Wura, the more he became consumed by her. His passion for art dwindled, and he found himself painting less and less. Instead, he spent all his time with her, focusing only on her beauty, her power, and the way she made him feel. He painted portraits of her, trying to capture the essence of her allure. But each portrait was never enough. She always seemed more radiant in person. Like the others, Ola soon became a servant to her will. He catered to her every need, painting when she demanded it and doing whatever she asked. His once promising career was now a distant memory, overshadowed by the all-consuming obsession he had with Madame Wura. But even as he became more and more enslaved to her, he couldn't help but feel that there was something dark and sinister beneath her charm, a truth he had yet to uncover. The mansion, once a sanctuary for the ambitious, now became a prison for Peter, Donald, and Ola. Each man lived under Madame Wura's spell, their lives revolving around her whims. She fed off their energy, each encounter leaving them weaker, while she grew more youthful and radiant. Yet the three men, now bound by an invisible chain, rarely crossed paths within the sprawling estate. Madame Wura kept them isolated, ensuring their loyalties remained solely hers. Peter, the lawyer, found his thoughts increasingly clouded. His mind, once sharp and decisive, now wandered aimlessly. He spent his days reviewing trivial legal cases Madame Wura handed him, work that served no real purpose other than keeping him occupied. His nights, however, were spent in her chambers, where she extracted his vitality with each touch, each whispered promise of eternal success. Donald, the businessman, fared no better. His once bustling hotel empire began to crumble as he neglected his duties. His staff whispered about their absent boss, who seemed to have vanished from the public eye. Donald, however, hardly noticed. Madame Wura kept him enthralled with the illusion of partnership, promising that her beauty and influence would elevate his brand to global recognition. He lived for her touch, her praise, oblivious to the decay of his world. Ola, the artist, became a shadow of his former self. The vibrant colors that once filled his canvases dulled, replaced by dark, chaotic strokes that mirrored the confusion in his soul. He painted obsessively, but every piece was of Madame Wura, her haunting eyes, her enigmatic smile. She hung these portraits throughout her mansion, each one a testament to her growing power. Ola's obsession deepened, and his art became his curse. Madame Wura, fully aware of her influence over the three men, decided it was time to expand her collection. Her beauty, now unmatched in the city, drew attention wherever she went. She relished the whispers, the stares, the envy, but her hunger for power and youth was insatiable. She needed more men, more energy, more souls to feed her dark magic. One evening, she attended a lavish cocktail party hosted by the city's elite. Her entrance was nothing short of mesmerizing. Dressed in a shimmering silver gown that clung to her perfect figure, she commanded the room with her mere presence. Every head turned, but her eyes were fixed on her next targets. She had already set her sights on a new trio of men, each one offering something unique to fuel her sinister plans. The first man she approached was Marcus, a renowned architect known for his groundbreaking designs. Marcus was captivated by her beauty, but even more intrigued by her apparent interest in his work. "I've seen your buildings," she said, her voice a melody. "They're magnificent, but I feel like you've yet to create your masterpiece." Her words struck a chord in Marcus, who had always felt his work was unfulfilled. By the end of the night, Madame Mora had secured his attention and his first visit to her mansion. Next, she turned her focus to Emmanuel, a young, ambitious politician whose charm and wit had made him a rising star. Madame Mora praised his ideals, drawing him into a private conversation about his vision for the city's future. She spoke with a passion that mirrored his own, making him feel as though she were the only person who truly understood him. When she touched his arm lightly, he felt a spark that he couldn't explain. He agreed to meet her again, eager to learn more about this captivating woman who seemed to believe in his dream. Finally, her gaze fell on Depo, a reclusive tech genius who rarely attended social events. Depo was awkward in conversation, but brilliant in his work. Madame Mora approached him with a disarming smile, praising his innovations and expressing interest in how technology could change the world. Her attention flustered him, and he stumbled over his words, but she found his shyness endearing. Before the night ended, she slipped her number into his hand, ensuring their paths would cross again. Within days, Madame Mora had drawn Marcus, Emmanuel, and Depo into her world. She used the same methods that had ensnared Peter, Donald, and Ola: flattery, seduction, and an uncanny ability to tap into their deepest desires. Each man believed they were special, chosen by her for reasons beyond their understanding. They visited her mansion separately, unaware of the others, and fell deeper into her trap with every encounter. Marcus, like Ola before him, found himself inspired by Madame Mora. She spoke of designing a private sanctuary for her, a space that reflected her beauty and power. Marcus, desperate to impress her, poured his heart and soul into the project. He spent sleepless nights sketching designs, each one grander than the last. Madame Mora rewarded his efforts with fleeting moments of intimacy that left him craving more. Emmanuel, the politician, became increasingly dependent on Madame Mora's approval. She attended his rallies, standing in the crowd like a beacon of support. Her presence gave him confidence, but it also made him vulnerable. He began consulting her on decisions, trusting her judgment over his own. She whispered promises of power and influence, binding him to her with every word. Depo, the tech genius, was perhaps the most naive of the three. He believed Madame Mora saw potential in him that no one else did. She encouraged his wildest ideas, funding his projects and praising his intellect. But her generosity came at a cost. Depo found himself spending more and more time at her mansion, drawn to her presence like a moth to a flame. As Madame Mora juggled her growing collection of men, her mansion became a labyrinth of secrets. The men rarely saw each other, but each felt a growing unease, a sense that something was amiss. They couldn't explain it, but they couldn't leave her either. Her beauty, her power, her promises, everything about her was addictive, and they were too far gone to escape. The walls of Madame Mora's mansion seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy, a silent testament to the power she was drawing from the men who were now trapped in her web. Marcus, Emmanuel, and Depo felt the oddness of the place but dismissed it, each too captivated by her beauty and promises to consider escaping. Madame Mora had perfected her craft, ensuring their loyalty while subtly stripping away their autonomy. Marcus's work on her sanctuary consumed him. Madame Mora's whispered ideas had taken root in his mind, evolving into an obsession. He worked tirelessly, creating intricate designs that combined elements of modern architecture with inexplicable, ancient motifs she described to him in passing. When he showed her his sketches, her approval came with soft touches and lingering gazes that left him desperate for her affection. Emmanuel's career began to falter as he focused more on pleasing Madame Mora than on his political ambitions. She became his muse and his distraction, her influence extending to his speeches and decisions. She convinced him to endorse causes he didn't fully understand, promising they would secure his future. Emmanuel believed her, even as whispers of his strange behavior began to circulate among his colleagues. Depo's dissent was the quietest, but perhaps the most devastating. Madame Mora's fascination with technology led her to demand innovations that defied logic. Depo, eager to impress her, began experimenting with projects that stretched the boundaries of ethics and reason. His colleagues noticed his absence from the tech world, but Depo barely noticed their concern. He was consumed by Madame Mora's demands, her presence fueling his every move. Madame Mora thrived on the chaos she created. Her beauty grew more radiant, her skin glowing with an otherworldly sheen that no one could explain. Each man provided her with a different kind of energy, and together they made her unstoppable. But even as she basked in her newfound power, a darker force began to stir within her mansion, as if the very foundation of her deeds had awakened something ominous. Peter, Donald, and Ola began to notice the subtle changes in Madame Mora. Her once alluring demeanor had taken on a sinister edge, her charm tinged with an intensity that made them uneasy. They whispered among themselves in the rare moments they crossed paths, their conversations filled with fragmented memories and unspoken fears. But none of them could bring themselves to leave. She was their captor and their obsession. One evening, Marcus stumbled upon a locked door while exploring the mansion. He had never seen it before, and something about it felt out of place. The ornate carvings on the door seemed to shift under his gaze, and a faint hum emanated from within. He tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. Madame Mora's voice suddenly echoed from behind him, soft yet commanding. "Some doors are better left closed, Marcus," she said, her smile both inviting and threatening. Marcus couldn't shake the memory of the door. That night, as he worked on his sketches, he found himself drawing the same strange patterns he had seen on it. The designs came to him unbidden, as if his hand was guided by an unseen force. He tried to stop, but the compulsion was too strong. By morning, his desk was covered in pages filled with intricate, haunting symbols. Emmanuel, too, began to sense something was wrong. During one of his visits to the mansion, he caught a glimpse of Depo in a room filled with glowing screens and humming machines. Depo's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and fascination. Emmanuel called out to him, but Depo didn't respond. Madame Mora appeared moments later, her presence immediately drawing Emmanuel's attention away. "Curiosity can be dangerous, darling," she said, leading him away with a smile that sent chills down his spine. Depo's experiments had taken a dark turn. Madame Mora had given him access to ancient texts and artifacts, items that seemed to defy explanation. He used them to create devices that felt more like magic than technology. The more he worked, the more he felt his sanity slipping. But Madame Mora's praise kept him going, her promises of greatness drowning out the whispers in his mind. Madame Mora's mansion had become a battleground of conflicting energies. The men's growing unease clashed with her insatiable hunger, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Strange occurrences became more frequent. Shadows that moved on their own, voices that whispered in the dead of night. The men tried to rationalize these events, but deep down, they knew something was horribly wrong. Despite their fears, none of the men could resist Madame Mora. Her allure was too strong, her beauty too captivating. She played them against each other, using their jealousy and insecurities to keep them under her control. Each man believed he was special, that he was the one who truly understood her. They didn't realize they were all pawns in her game. One night, Madame Mora hosted a grand party at the mansion. The city's elite gathered, dazzled by her charm and beauty. She moved through the crowd like a queen, her every gesture calculated to command attention. Marcus, Emmanuel, and Depo watched from the shadows, each man burning with a mix of admiration and jealousy. They didn't notice the other men who shared their fate, their presence hidden by Madame Mora's careful manipulation. As the night wore on, Madame Mora introduced a new man to the party, a mysterious figure who seemed immune to her charms. He watched her with a knowing gaze, his presence unsettling her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Madame Mora tried to dismiss him, but his words cut through her defenses like a knife. "You've gone too far, Wora," he said softly, his voice filled with an authority that made her blood run cold. The man's appearance marked a turning point in the mansion's atmosphere. The strange occurrences intensified, the shadows growing darker and the whispers louder. Madame Mora felt her control slipping, her once perfect facade beginning to crack. But she refused to show weakness, determined to maintain her power at any cost. The party ended abruptly, and Madame Mora retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. Who was that man? How did he know her name? She felt a flicker of fear, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. But she quickly pushed it aside, focusing instead on her next move. She couldn't afford to falter, not now, not ever. The mysterious man lingered in Madame Mora's thoughts long after the party ended. His knowing eyes and cryptic words unsettled her, challenging the confidence she had so carefully cultivated. She paced her opulent chambers, the velvet curtains swaying with the chill of an unexplainable draft. For the first time in years, Madame Mora questioned whether her power was truly invincible. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't sleep. The image of the locked door haunted him, its shifting carvings etched into his memory. He decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight, he crept through the mansion's dimly lit corridors, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As he approached the door, the hum grew louder, resonating in his chest like a second heartbeat. Marcus reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, the door seemed to ripple. A low, guttural sound emanated from the other side, freezing him in place. Suddenly, Madame Mora's voice sliced through the silence. "What are you doing, Marcus?" she asked, her tone sharp yet oddly calm. He turned to find her standing behind him, her silhouette backlit by the eerie glow of the hallway lights. "I was curious," Marcus stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Madame Mora stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Curiosity can be dangerous," she said, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, Marcus felt as if she could see straight into his soul. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers cool against his skin. "Come back to bed, darling," she whispered, leading him away. In another part of the mansion, Emmanuel was awake, too. He sat in a darkened room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His mind replayed the moment he had seen Depo surrounded by those glowing screens. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He decided to confront Depo, hoping to uncover the truth about what was happening in the mansion. When Emmanuel found Depo, the younger man was hunched over a desk, scribbling furiously in a notebook. The room was cluttered with strange devices and artifacts, their designs unlike anything Emmanuel had ever seen. "Depo," Emmanuel said, his voice firm. Depo jumped, startled. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I should ask you the same question," Emmanuel replied. He gestured to the bizarre objects scattered around the room. "What is all this?" Depo hesitated, his gaze shifting to the door as if considering an escape. Finally, he sighed. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "Try me," Emmanuel insisted, his curiosity piqued. Depo reluctantly began to explain. He told Emmanuel about the ancient texts Madame Mora had given him, how they spoke of rituals and energies that defied logic. "She says they're the key to unlocking true power," Depo said, his voice tinged with both fear and fascination. Emmanuel felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that Madame Mora's influence was far more sinister than he had imagined. While Emmanuel and Depo talked, Madame Mora stood in her private sanctum, a room hidden deep within the mansion. The air was thick with incense, and the walls were adorned with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She knelt before an ornate mirror, her reflection distorted and shifting. "Show me," she commanded, her voice steady. The mirror surface rippled, revealing the image of the mysterious man from the party. He stood in a darkened alley, his expression grim. "Who are you?" Madame Mora demanded, her voice laced with anger. The man's reflection turned to face her, his gaze piercing. "Your time is running out, Wara," he said, his voice echoing as if coming from the depths of the mirror. "You cannot escape the consequences forever." Madame Wora's frustration boiled over. She slammed her hand against the mirror, shattering the image. The shards fell to the floor, but when she looked down, the mirror was whole again. The man's image had disappeared, replaced by her own reflection. She stared at herself, her beauty unmarred but her eyes filled with uncertainty. For the first time, She felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Back in the mansion, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He found himself drawn to Emmanuel and Depo, sensing that they shared his unease. The three men began to talk, piecing together their experiences with Madame Moura. They realized that they were not alone in their suspicions, but they also knew that confronting her was a dangerous proposition. Madame Moura sensed the shift in the men's behavior. They were growing restless, their loyalty faltering. She knew she had to act quickly to maintain her control. She invited them all to a lavish dinner, her charm turned up to its highest setting. The men couldn't resist her, their doubts momentarily overshadowed by her intoxicating presence. As the dinner progressed, Madame Moura subtly tested each man, probing their weaknesses and reinforcing her hold on them. She laughed at Marcus's jokes, praised Emmanuel's intelligence, and admired Depo's creativity. But even as she worked to regain their trust, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that lingered in the back of her mind. Later that night, Madame Moura stood on the balcony of her mansion, gazing out at the city lights. She felt the power coursing through her veins, but it was tainted by a nagging fear. The mysterious man's words echoed in her mind. You cannot escape the consequences forever. She clenched her fists, determined to prove him wrong. In the days that followed, strange events continued to plague the mansion. Objects moved on their own. Whispers filled the air, and the men's unease grew. They began to see visions of the men who had come before them, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. The mansion seemed to pulse with a life of its own, feeding on their fear and confusion. Madame Moura tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks in her facade were becoming harder to hide. She spent more time in her sanctum, searching for answers in the ancient texts and artifacts she had collected. She knew she was running out of time, but she refused to admit it. Her pride wouldn't allow her to show weakness. The men began to plan their escape, each secretly hoping to break free from Madame Moura's grasp. But the mansion seemed to conspire against them, its doors locking and its corridors shifting like a maze. They realized that leaving would not be easy, and that Madame Moura would not let them go without a fight. One night, as Marcus, Emmanuel, and Depo huddled together in a hidden corner of the mansion, they heard a faint knock on the wall. They froze, their hearts pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a narrow passage. A voice whispered from the darkness, "If you want to survive, follow me. S." The men hesitated, unsure whether to trust the voice. But the passageway seemed to offer their only chance at escape. They stepped inside, the air cold and damp. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The voice guided them, its tone urgent yet calm. Madame Moura stood in her sanctum, her eyes closed as she chanted an incantation. The air around her crackled with energy, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter. She didn't know that the men had found the hidden passage, nor did she realize that her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel.